Hi, my name is Dr. Philis Barragán Goetz, and I am an assistant professor here at Texas A&M-San Antonio. The research that I do is focused on the history of education in Texas, particularly for Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans. So most of the time, whenever the subject of education comes up in our society, it's always discussed as a key to socioeconomic mobility, upward mobility, or a gateway to a better life. And it certainly is that. I can tell you that, speaking personally, it was that for me. I'm a first generation college student, and my decision to pursue education, my education, changed my life, and it changed the life of my family members as well. But education also there's this whole other complicated aspect to education, the role that it plays in our society. So as I just discussed, it certainly is a vehicle for individuals and communities to assert agency, right, to negotiate their way through the world, to attain this upward socioeconomic mobility. But it's also a vehicle for oppression and a vehicle for discrimination. So the Texas public school system got its start in 1854 with the school law of 1854 is what it was actually called. But for various reasons, it was very slow to grow. So that by the time you get to 1870, which was 5 years after the end of the Civil War, there were maybe 3 public schools in the entire state of Texas. There was 1 in San Antonio and 2 in New Braunfels. Now, there were other schools in the state. There were various private schools, there were parochial religious schools, and there were ethnic Mexican community schools called escuelitas. But in terms of official schools through the state, there were only maybe 3 of them. And the public school system doesn't actually start to expand until the mid-1880s, when the progressive education movement makes its way to Texas. Now, the progressive education movement was responsible for the expansion of the public school system, but then also things like a more standardized curriculum, certification requirements for teachers. Before that, you didn't have to have a certificate or anything of that nature to become a teacher. So these developments that I think most people would agree were positive in some way. But the progressive education movement also had a dark side in that it depended heavily on segregation as it pursued its expansion. And when I say segregation, I'm referring to the segregation of ethnic Mexican children, Black American children, and white American children, right? Keeping them all in separate schools. So the segregation of Black children, though, that was sanctioned in the 1876 state constitution, right? Where the Constitution said there will be a public school system, there will be separate schools for whites and blacks, right? Period, the end. So segregation is part of that constitutional document. The segregation of Mexican and Mexican American children, though, was different because legally those populations were supposed to be considered white, right? But in practice they weren't. So how do you justify their segregation? So time and time again, so many school officials made the case that it was not race-based segregation, that it was based on their educational needs, right? That they were being segregated because they didn't understand what it meant to be an American, that they didn't speak English, and that they weren't as smart as white children. So putting them in a room together, in a classroom together, would be a disaster because these ethnic Mexican children would feel so inferior, and the white American children wouldn't be working to their fullest potential because the curriculum would have to make up for these slow kids that they were sharing a classroom with, right? This is what school administrators argued. And in case after case, desegregation cases on behalf of ethnic Mexican children, in each of these cases, this was the argument that school administrators made. Right? That it wasn't race-based segregation, that it was pedagogical, and pedagogy refers to like the expertise of teaching, right? It was their educational needs. That was why they were segregated. But the thing was that nobody ever tested these children. No one ever tried to assess how much English they knew, how much math they knew, what their reading skills were like, anything like that. It was completely based on skin color and their last name. So in that regard, um, pedagogical segregation was this cloak for race-based segregation. And you see these arguments kind of battling from the 1920s well into the 20th century. So as this brief overview of educational history of Texas demonstrates, is that education is very political, right? Choosing to pursue your education, whether or not you realize it, is a political act. So keep that in mind as you pursue your college career. And I look forward to seeing any of you in a future history class, and I wish you the best.